It was 11:47 p.m. and I was lying in bed, my phone's blue light cutting through the darkness like a cold knife, my finger hovering over the banking app icon because some part of me believed that if I didn't look, maybe the bills wouldn't be real, maybe the numbers would somehow change, maybe God would perform a midnight miracle in my account while I slept. But deep down, I knew what was waiting for me behind that little green icon, and when I finally tapped it, there it was in brutal black and white. $12.47 standing between me and complete financial collapse, and as I stared at those numbers, my chest tightened because the phone bill was $89. And due tomorrow, rent was already 6 days overdue with late fees piling up like snow in a storm. And that yellow hydro notice had arrived yesterday with final warning stamped across it in red letters that seemed to mock every prayer I'd whispered over the past 3 months. The descent had begun so gradually that I almost didn't notice it at first, like stepping into quicksand that looks like solid ground until you're already sinking. And it all started with that text from my manager last month, a casual message that landed like a bomb. "Hey team, due to budget constraints, we're reducing everyone's hours effective immediately. Sorry for the inconvenience." And just like that, my 40 hours became 22. My steady paycheck became a prayer request. My financial stability became a house of cards in a hurricane, and I remember staring at that text for 10 minutes, thinking this had to be a joke, had to be a mistake, had to be anything other than the reality that was about to reshape my entire world. I started driving for Uber to bridge the gap, downloading the app with the desperate hope that the gig economy would save me, spending my evenings picking up drunk college kids and tired office workers, pretending I was just making extra money for vacation while secretly calculating whether I could afford to buy the coffee they were sipping in my back seat, watching my gas gauge drop while gas prices climbed to $1.45 per liter, doing mental math that revealed I was making about $8 an hour after expenses, $8 an hour to smile at strangers while my world crumbled around me, $8 an hour to maintain the illusion that I was still in control while everything spun wildly out of my grasp. The grocery store became my personal torture chamber, a place where I performed complex mathematical equations in my head while standing in the cereal aisle, picking up items and putting them back, calculating protein per dollar, comparing rice prices like they were stock options, telling myself that eggs were protein and rice was filling and toilet paper was optional because I could grab extra napkins from work, watching my cart get smaller each week while other people filled theirs without a second thought. And I started recognizing the faces of other people doing the same desperate dance, the way we'd avoid eye contact while counting change, the way we'd pretend we were just being health conscious when we put back the ice cream and the cookies, and anything that resembled joy instead of mere survival. The shame was the worst part, wrapping around me like a heavy coat I couldn't take off, making me lie to everyone who cared about me, because admitting financial failure felt like admitting I was a failure as a person. So when church friends asked how I was doing, I'd flash that practiced smile and say, "Oh, just budgeting tight this month." When my mom called to check in and asked if I was eating well, I'd say, "Yeah, I'm trying to eat healthier," which was technically true since rice and beans were probably better for me than fast food. And when unknown numbers started calling, my heart would race with anxiety because I knew they were collection agencies, creditors, companies that wanted money I didn't have, so I started letting every unknown call go to voicemail, started checking my caller ID like it was a lottery ticket I was afraid to scratch. I found myself checking couch cushions for quarters that weren't there, digging through old purses and jacket pockets with the desperate hope of finding forgotten money, selling my college textbooks online for a whopping $3.50 total, listing my old laptop on Marketplace for 2 weeks without a single inquiry, watering down my shampoo to make it last longer, timing my showers to save on the water bill, unplugging everything when I left the house because every kilowatt mattered. And through it all, I kept praying for provision, kept asking God to make a way where there seemed to be no way, kept believing that somehow, some way, breakthrough was coming. But as days turned into weeks and weeks, turned into months, I started wondering if my prayers were even making it past the ceiling, if God was listening, if He cared, if the faith I'd built my life on was just a beautiful fairy tale I'd been telling myself. I'd been faithful when I had more, had tithed consistently when my paychecks were steady, had served in children's ministry every Sunday, had helped other people through their tough times, had been the one others came to for financial advice. And now here I was, drowning in the very circumstances I'd helped others navigate, wondering why God seemed silent when I needed him most, why the provision I'd seen him provide for others seemed to bypass my address, why I felt more alone in my faith than I ever had before. And as I lay there at 11:47 p.m., staring at $12.47, I whispered into the darkness, "God, have you forgotten me?" And the silence that followed felt heavier than any answer could have been. Have you ever stared at an overdue notice and wondered if heaven even noticed you? If your prayers were getting lost somewhere between your lips and God's ears? If maybe you'd done something wrong? Something that had disqualified you from his provision, something that had moved you from the blessed list to the forgotten list, because that's exactly where I was, questioning everything I thought I knew about God's love, his faithfulness, his promises, wondering if maybe I'd misunderstood something fundamental about how faith and finances were supposed to work together. But I had no idea that what felt like abandonment was actually preparation, that what looked like delay was actually perfect timing, that God wasn't absent from my story, but was writing a chapter I couldn't see yet, orchestrating a breakthrough that would require me to be exactly where I was, exactly when I was there, broken enough to receive what he wanted to give, humble enough to recognize it as his hand and not my hard work, desperate enough to understand that provision isn't just about money, but about learning who God really is when everything else fails. The morning everything collapsed started like any other morning, with me checking my phone for overnight miracles that never came, getting dressed in clothes I'd been wearing too many times between washes because laundry cost money, and walking out to my car with the hope that it would start and get me through another day. But as I backed out of my driveway, there was a grinding noise that made my heart sink, a sound that meant expensive problems I couldn't afford to solve. And when I pulled into the mechanic's shop 2 hours later after nursing the car there at 15 miles per hour, the estimate hit me like a physical blow. $850 for repairs that couldn't wait. $850 that might as well have been $8,500 for all the reality it held in my world. $850 to fix a car I needed to get to work to make money. I didn't have to pay for repairs I couldn't afford. The perfect catch-22 that felt like life was playing a cruel joke on me. I walked home from the mechanic's shop because I couldn't afford the tow and the car couldn't be driven, and when I turned onto my street, I saw it from 3 houses away, that white piece of paper taped to my front door like a flag of surrender, and I knew before I got close enough to read it what it was going to say. But somehow, seeing "Final Eviction Notice" in bold black letters still knocked the wind out of me, still made my knees weak, still filled me with a shame so deep I looked around to see if any neighbors were watching, if anyone had witnessed this public declaration of my failure. And Mrs. Henderson from next door was getting her mail, and we made eye contact for a split second before both of us pretended we hadn't seen each other, both of us participating in the awkward dance of neighborhood embarrassment. I crumpled up the notice and shoved it in my pocket like that would make it less real, like hiding the evidence would change the facts. And I went inside to a house that was already showing signs of my financial distress, empty cupboards, empty refrigerator humming with nothing but condiments and hope, empty spaces where I'd sold anything of value, and I sat on my couch and tried to make sense of how I'd gotten here, how someone who had done everything right could end up so wrong, how someone who had trusted God could feel so abandoned by him. And that's when I heard the click that every person in financial crisis dreads, the sound of the power being shut off, the sudden silence when all the electrical humming stops, the refrigerator going quiet, the lights refusing to turn on. And I realized I was sitting in what would soon be a dark, cold house with no way to cook food I couldn't afford anyway. I tried flipping the light switch anyway. That human instinct that hopes maybe the power company made a mistake, maybe the switch would magically work, but of course nothing happened. And as evening fell and darkness crept into my house like a physical presence, I found myself eating cold soup straight from the can by the light of my phone. And that's when something inside me finally snapped, when the pressure and frustration and fear that had been building for months finally found its voice. And I found myself yelling at God in ways I'd never yelled before, standing in my dark living room with a can of cold soup in one hand and my dying phone in the other, screaming, "I did everything right," at the ceiling like God was hard of hearing, like maybe he'd missed the memo about my faithfulness. "I gave when I had it. I served in your house. I trusted you with my finances. I helped other people through their struggles. I've been faithful. So why is this happening to me?" And my voice cracked on that last part, because underneath all the anger was a hurt so deep it felt like drowning, a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than any financial crisis ever could. "I'm not asking for a mansion," I continued, my voice echoing in the empty house. "I'm not asking for luxury cars or designer clothes or exotic vacations. I'm just asking for help, God. Just help me survive. Help me pay my rent. Help myself keep the lights on. Help me buy groceries without counting every penny. Help me answer my phone without fear. Help me sleep at night without calculating bills in my head." Is that too much to ask from the God who owns everything? And when I finished yelling, the silence that followed was so complete, so profound, that it felt like the universe itself was holding its breath. And I sank onto my couch and cried tears that came from a place deeper than my bank account, deeper than my immediate circumstances, from a place that wondered if God really saw me, really cared, really remembered my name when so many other people seemed to have his attention. My friend, Sarah, texted me that night asking if I wanted to grab coffee in the morning, and I stared at that text for 15 minutes, trying to figure out how to say no without explaining why, how to maintain relationships when you can't afford to participate in them. So I typed back, "Rain check, swamped with work," and hit send, knowing she'd probably think I was blowing her off, knowing our friendship was one more casualty of my financial crisis, knowing that isolation was becoming my default setting, because it was easier than explaining why I couldn't afford a $4 latte when I'd been able to afford them just months ago. I went to bed that night wearing my winter coat because the heat had been shut off along with the electricity, piling every blanket I owned on top of me and still shivering, praying through chattering teeth. "God, I know you see when sparrows fall. The Bible says, you know when they hit the ground. So do you see me? Do you see me falling? Do you see me hitting the ground? Because I feel like I'm in free fall and I can't find anything to grab onto, can't find any evidence that you're working, can't find any reason to believe that tomorrow will be different from today." And as I lay there in the dark, cold and scared and more alone than I'd ever felt in my life, I had the strangest dream. A dream where I was walking into a church I'd never seen before, a church with white walls and golden lights streaming through tall windows. And someone I couldn't quite see was walking toward me, holding out a set of keys. And they placed the keys in my hand and said, "These are for you. You're going to need them soon." And I woke up confused but oddly comforted, still cold, still broke, still facing the same impossible circumstances. But something had shifted in my heart. Some small seed of hope had been planted in the frozen ground of my despair. And while I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, couldn't even fully embrace it yet, there was a whisper of peace that hadn't been there before, a sense that maybe, just maybe, God hadn't forgotten my address after all. Have you ever noticed that God's rescue rarely matches our timeline, that his intervention doesn't always look like what we expected, that sometimes what feels like delay is actually perfect orchestration? Because while I was demanding immediate relief, God was setting up a series of encounters and opportunities that would meet my need in ways I couldn't have imagined, wouldn't have asked for, and couldn't have orchestrated on my own. I woke up the next morning, still cold, but somehow different, like something had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere around me. And I started cleaning my house not because I had guests coming, but because I needed something to do with my hands, something to keep me busy while I processed the dream, the prayer, the strange sense that change was coming, even though my circumstances looked exactly the same. And as I was going through my winter coat closet, pulling out coats I hadn't worn in months, my hand closed around something crumpled in the pocket of my heavy blue coat. And when I pulled it out and smoothed it flat, I almost started crying right there in my closet because it was a $5 bill, wrinkled and forgotten. But in that moment it felt like finding buried treasure, like God had left me a love note in my darkest hour, and I held that $5 like it was made of gold, knowing it would buy me eggs and rice, knowing it meant one more meal, one more day. one more small reason to believe that provision was possible. I walked to the grocery store because I couldn't afford gas, and because walking gave me time to think, time to pray, time to process the weird mix of gratitude and desperation that was swirling around in my chest. And as I stood in the checkout line with my eggs and rice, counting and recounting my $5 to make sure I had enough, the woman in front of me dropped her wallet, and a $20 bill fluttered to the ground like a green leaf, and without thinking, I picked it up and tapped her on the shoulder. "Excuse me, you dropped this," and handed her the 20, and she turned around and looked at me with such kindness in her eyes, such genuine warmth, that I felt seen for the first time in months. And she said, "Keep it, honey. God told me you need it more than I do." And I tried to refuse, tried to explain that I couldn't take her money, but she insisted with a firmness that felt like divine authority. "I know what it's like, sweetie. I've been where you are, and someone did this for me once. Now it's your turn to receive." And she squeezed my hand and walked away before I could protest further, leaving me standing there with $25 total, more money than I'd seen in weeks. And I made it exactly 3 steps toward the exit before I started crying in the middle of the grocery store, not because of the money, though that was amazing, but because someone had seen me, really seen me, had looked past my brave face and my attempt to hold it together, and had recognized a fellow traveler on the hard road of financial struggle. I sat in my car in the grocery store parking lot and cried for 10 minutes, big, ugly tears that came from somewhere deep, tears of relief and gratitude and wonder, because in that moment I felt like God had cracked open the sky just enough to whisper, "I haven't forgotten you. I see you. I know where you are, and I'm working on your behalf even when you can't see it." And for the first time in months, I felt hope stirring in my chest, not hope that my circumstances would change immediately, but hope that I wasn't alone in them, that God was present in my struggle even when he seemed absent from my solutions, that maybe his silence hadn't been abandonment, but preparation for something I couldn't see yet. When I got home, I cooked those eggs like they were a feast, seasoned that rice like it was a gourmet meal, and ate dinner by candlelight. Not because it was romantic, but because I still didn't have electricity. But somehow that meal tasted different, felt different, like gratitude had seasoned it in ways that salt and pepper never could. And as I sat there eating by the flickering light, I found myself praying differently, not demanding or pleading or bargaining, but just saying, "Thank you, God. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the $5 in my coat. Thank you for the woman who wouldn't let me return her 20. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not invisible, that I'm not forgotten, that somehow, some way, you're working even when I can't see it." And that prayer felt more powerful than all my desperate begging had, felt like the beginning of a conversation instead of the end of my rope. The next day, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and normally I would have let it go to voicemail because unknown numbers had become triggers for anxiety. But something made me answer it. Maybe it was the hope from the day before, maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was just divine prompting. And the voice on the other end said, "Hi, this is Jennifer from Morrison Marketing. We have your application on file for some freelance remote work, and we have a project that might be perfect for you. Would you be interested in discussing it?" And I almost dropped the phone, because I had completely forgotten about that application, had submitted it 2 months ago when I was first starting to panic about money, had written it off as another dead end when I didn't hear back immediately. But here it was, calling me exactly when I needed it most, offering me 2 weeks of remote work that wouldn't solve all my problems, but would definitely help me breathe a little easier, would give me enough to catch up on some bills, enough to buy groceries without counting every penny, enough to believe that maybe God's timing wasn't late after all, just different from mine. I worked on that project with more focus and dedication than I'd brought to anything in months, partly because I needed the money desperately, but partly because it felt like a gift, like God had reached down into my circumstances and handed me exactly what I needed exactly when I needed it. And every day that I logged into my computer and worked on marketing copy for a company I'd never heard of felt like a small miracle. Felt like evidence that God's provision comes in all shapes and sizes, sometimes dramatic and supernatural, sometimes practical and perfectly timed, sometimes through strangers who obey promptings they don't understand, sometimes through opportunities we'd forgotten we'd created. That week, as I worked and earned money and felt hope creeping back into my daily routine, I started noticing things I'd missed in my desperation, like how my neighbor had been leaving extra vegetables from her garden on my doorstep, how the local food bank had started offering free dinners on Wednesdays, how opportunities for provision were everywhere once I started looking for them with eyes of faith instead of eyes of fear. And I realized that maybe God's provision had been flowing all along, but my panic and shame and pride had blocked me from seeing it, from receiving it, from recognizing His hand in the small kindnesses and unexpected opportunities that had been surrounding me even in my darkest moments. Have you ever felt like God cracked open the sky just enough to say, "I haven't forgotten you," like maybe His silence wasn't absence, but the quiet before breakthrough? Like maybe what looked like delay was actually perfect timing orchestrated by a God who sees the whole picture while we can only see our immediate need. Because that's exactly what was happening in my story, even though I couldn't see it yet, couldn't understand that every difficult day had been positioning me for a miracle that would require me to be exactly where I was, exactly when I was there, ready to receive what He wanted to give in ways I never could have imagined. I was walking to the store the following week, still conserving every penny by walking instead of driving, still living day by day, but with considerably more hope than I'd had in months, when I saw a familiar face coming toward me on the sidewalk, Sister Margaret from my church, a woman I'd spoken to maybe 3 times in passing, always friendly but not someone I knew well, and normally I might have crossed the street to avoid an awkward conversation about how I was doing. But something made me keep walking straight. Maybe it was the new hope I was carrying. Maybe it was curiosity about what she was doing in my neighborhood. Maybe it was just divine appointment disguised as coincidence. And when we were close enough to make eye contact, she called out my name and walked directly toward me with purpose in her step, and something that looked like determination in her eyes. "I'm so glad I ran into you," she said, reaching into her purse. "This is going to sound really strange, but God has been putting you on my heart for days, and He told me to give you this. I don't even know why. I just know I'm supposed to." And she pulled out a white envelope and held it toward me, and I tried to take a step back, tried to politely decline, tried to say, "Oh, Sister Margaret, that's so kind, but I couldn't possibly." But she pushed the envelope into my hands with a firmness that surprised me, and when I felt the thickness of it, my heart started beating faster because I could tell there was money inside, more money than a 5 or a 20. And she saw the confusion on my face and said, "Honey, I don't know what you're going through, but I know what it's like to need help and be too proud to ask for it. I know what it's like to smile at church while drowning at home. I know what it's like to trust God for provision while wondering if He really sees your need. And 5 years ago, someone did exactly this for me when I needed it most. So this isn't charity, this isn't pity, this is kingdom. This is how God's family takes care of each other. This is love with skin on it. And you're going to take this envelope and you're going to use it for whatever you need most. And someday, when you're in a position to help someone else, you're going to remember this moment and you're going to be someone else's miracle." I stood there on the sidewalk holding that envelope with tears streaming down my face, not just because of what was inside it, though that was overwhelming, but because of what she'd said about knowing what it was like, about smiling at church while drowning at home, about being too proud to ask for help. Because in that moment, I realized I wasn't the first person to walk this road, wasn't the only one who'd struggled to reconcile faith and financial crisis, wasn't alone in the shame and fear and desperate prayers that had consumed my life for months. And when I finally got home and opened that envelope with shaking hands, I found $400 in cash, $400 that represented rent money, utility deposits, grocery money, breathing room, hope made tangible, God's provision wrapped in the kindness of someone who had learned to listen to His voice and obey His promptings even when they didn't make sense to her natural mind. I paid my rent that afternoon, late fees and all, and I'll never forget the look on my landlord's face when I showed up with cash in hand after weeks of avoiding his calls, the way his expression shifted from frustration to relief, the way he said, "I'm glad you figured it out. I really didn't want to have to evict you." And I wanted to tell him I hadn't figured anything out, that God had figured it out for me, that provision had found me when I couldn't find it. But instead, I just said, "Thank you for your patience," and walked away with a receipt that felt like a victory trophy, like evidence that God wasn't done with my story yet, like proof that breakthrough sometimes comes through the hands of people who are willing to be used by Him in ways that don't make sense to the natural mind. The power company was equally surprised when I called to arrange restoration of service, and when the lights came back on that evening, I stood in my living room and laughed out loud, not because anything was particularly funny, but because joy was bubbling up from somewhere deep inside me. Joy that had nothing to do with my circumstances and everything to do with the realization that God had been working all along, orchestrating encounters and opportunities, moving in the hearts of people I barely knew, coordinating a rescue mission that looked nothing like what I'd expected but everything like what I needed. And as I walked through my house turning on lights I hadn't been able to use for days, I felt like I was celebrating more than just electricity. I was celebrating the faithfulness of a God who never stops working on behalf of His children, even when they can't see His hand, even when they doubt His heart, even when they wonder if their prayers are bouncing off the ceiling. That night I went grocery shopping for the first time in months without calculating every purchase, without choosing between eggs and toilet paper, without the knot of anxiety in my stomach that had become my constant companion, and I filled my cart with actual meals instead of just survival rations, with fruit and vegetables and bread and milk and all the ordinary things that had become luxuries in my world of scarcity. And when I got to the checkout line and handed over cash instead of counting change, the cashier smiled at me and said, "Having a good day?" And I realized I actually was, that somewhere between Sister Margaret's envelope and my restored power and my full grocery cart, good had broken through into my circumstances, hope had found its footing, faith had remembered its voice, and I was having the kind of good day I'd forgotten was possible, the kind that comes not from perfect circumstances, but from perfect timing, not from having everything I wanted, but from receiving exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it most. The job interview call came 3 days later, another forgotten application from months ago suddenly bearing fruit. And when I walked into that office building for the first time in my best clothes, which weren't saying much but were clean and pressed and hopeful, I felt different than I had in months, not because my circumstances had completely changed, though they were definitely improving, but because my perspective had shifted, because I'd seen God's provision in action, because I'd experienced firsthand what it meant to be carried through impossible situations by a God who specializes in making ways where there seemed to be none. And that confidence, that quiet assurance that I was being held by hands bigger than my problems, must have shown in the interview because I got the job, not a perfect job, not a dream job, but a steady job with steady income and steady hope for the future, the kind of stability I'd taken for granted before and would never take for granted again. As I sat in my car after the interview, looking at the building where I would be working, remembering the dream I'd had weeks ago about someone handing me keys, I realized that maybe those keys weren't literal house keys, but keys to provision, keys to breakthrough, keys to understanding how God works in the lives of His children, keys to a deeper faith that could weather any storm because it was built not on my ability to figure things out, but on His ability to make all things work together for good. And I pulled out my phone and called Sister Margaret to thank her again, to tell her about the job, to let her know that her obedience had been the catalyst for a whole series of miracles. And when she answered, her first words were, "I've been praying for you. How are things going?" And I found myself laughing and crying at the same time as I told her the story, as I connected the dots between her envelope and my rent payment and my restored utilities and my new job. As I realized that God's provision isn't always a single miracle, but sometimes a series of perfectly timed interventions orchestrated by a God who sees the beginning from the end and works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. On my first day at the new job, I found a church bulletin from the previous Sunday folded in my jacket pocket, and when I unfolded it during my lunch break, my eyes immediately went to the verse printed in bold at the bottom. "And my God will supply every need of yours according to His riches in glory in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:19. And for the first time since this whole journey began, that verse didn't feel like a promise I was trying to claim or a hope I was desperately clinging to. It felt like a truth I had experienced, a reality I had lived, a guarantee I could count on, not because I understood how it worked, but because I had seen it work, had felt its power, had received its blessing in ways I never could have imagined or orchestrated. And I realized that God hadn't been late in his provision. He had been precise, arriving exactly when I needed him most, exactly when I was ready to receive what he wanted to give, exactly when I could recognize his hand and give him glory for what he had done. Have you ever looked back on a difficult season and realized that God wasn't just meeting your need? He was also reshaping your heart in the process, teaching you things about his character and your identity that could only be learned in the valley, preparing you for a future you couldn't see by breaking you free from limitations you didn't even know you had. Because that's exactly what was happening in my story. And the transformation that was taking place in me was going to prove even more valuable than the financial breakthrough I'd received. Though at the time, I was just grateful to be able to pay my bills and buy groceries and answer my phone without fear. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same living room where I'd yelled at God in the darkness, but now the lights were on and the bills were paid, and there was food in the refrigerator and peace in my heart. But the most remarkable thing wasn't that my circumstances had changed, though they certainly had. It was that I had changed, that the person paying those bills was fundamentally different from the person who had been unable to pay them, not because I was making more money or had better budgeting skills, though both of those things were true, but because I had learned something about God's character that could only be learned in the furnace of financial crisis, something about his timing that could only be understood from the perspective of someone who had waited in desperation and received in perfect precision, something about his provision that went far deeper than money and touched the core of who I was and who I was becoming in him. When my bank balance got low now, which it still did sometimes because life is life, and bills are bills, and unexpected expenses still pop up, I didn't panic the way I used to, didn't lie awake at night calculating and recalculating, didn't avoid looking at my banking app, didn't screen my calls or hide from my mail, because I had experienced firsthand what it meant to be carried by a God who specializes in impossible situations, who makes ways where there are no ways, who provides for his children not just financially but emotionally and spiritually and in every way they need to be provided for. And that knowledge, that deep down assurance that I was held by hands bigger than my problems, had become more valuable than any amount of money I could have in the bank, more precious than any job security I could achieve, more powerful than any financial planning I could do. Because it was based not on my ability to manage my circumstances, but on God's ability to manage them for me. I started volunteering at the local food bank, the same one where I had stood in line just months earlier, too proud to make eye contact, too ashamed to admit I needed help, too broken to believe that things could ever be different. And now I was on the other side of the table, looking into faces that reflected my own journey, recognizing the mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that I knew so well, understanding the courage it took to walk through those doors and ask for help. And I found that I could speak hope into their situations, not because I had all the answers, but because I had lived the questions, not because I had never struggled, but because I had struggled and been carried through, not because I was naturally gifted at encouragement, but because I had been encouraged by God in ways that made me want to pass that encouragement along to others who needed it as desperately as I once had. I started what I called God's drawer in my kitchen, a simple wooden drawer where I put $10 every week, money set aside specifically for the next person who would need it, money that represented my faith in God's continued provision, money that acknowledged that I had been blessed to be a blessing, that I had received not just for my own benefit, but so that I could be part of God's provision for someone else. And the first time I had to make a withdrawal from that drawer, it was to slip a grocery gift card under the windshield wiper of a car where I could see someone crying behind the steering wheel, someone who looked exactly like I had looked 6 months earlier, someone who needed to know they weren't invisible, weren't forgotten, weren't alone in their struggle. And as I walked away from that car, I realized that God had turned me from someone who needed provision into someone who could provide, from someone who was desperate for miracles into someone who could be part of someone else's miracle. And that transformation was worth more than all the money in the world because it connected me to God's heart in ways I had never experienced before. The shame that had wrapped around me like chains during my financial crisis was completely gone. replaced by a confidence that had nothing to do with my bank balance and everything to do with my understanding of God's love, God's faithfulness, God's commitment to His children. And I found that I could talk openly about my struggles now, could share my story without embarrassment, could admit when I was going through difficult times without feeling like I was admitting failure, because I had learned that needing help wasn't a sign of weakness, but an opportunity for God to show His strength, that financial struggle wasn't evidence of spiritual failure, but sometimes the very classroom where spiritual growth happens, that asking for prayer wasn't admitting defeat, but acknowledging that we were never meant to walk through life alone, that we are part of a body where each member supports the others, where each person's struggle becomes an opportunity for others to show love, where each victory becomes a testimony to God's goodness that encourages everyone who hears it. My identity had shifted in the most fundamental way possible, from someone who was defined by what I could accomplish, what I could afford, what I could manage on my own, to someone who was defined by how much I was loved by God, how perfectly He provided for me, how completely He could be trusted with every aspect of my life. And that shift changed everything about how I approached relationships, work, money, prayer, worship, service, and every other area of my existence. Because when you know deep in your soul that you are held by a God who will never let you fall, who will never abandon you to your circumstances, who will always make a way when there seems to be no way, it affects every decision you make, every fear you face, every hope you hold, every prayer you pray, every step you take into an uncertain future that suddenly doesn't seem nearly as scary as it used to, because you know who holds tomorrow, and you know He holds you too. I didn't just survive financial lack, I learned who God was in it, learned who I was in Him, learned that His provision goes so much deeper than money, so much wider than circumstances, so much higher than anything I could ask or think or imagine, and that education, that revelation, that transformation was worth every sleepless night, every anxious moment, every tear I cried, every prayer I whispered in desperation, because it connected me to the heart of a God who loves His children so much that He will allow them to walk through valleys in order to show them mountains they never knew existed, will permit temporary discomfort in order to produce eternal confidence, will use what the enemy meant for harm to bring about good that exceeds anything we could have experienced if we had never needed rescue in the first place. One evening, almost a year after my power had been shut off, I was cleaning out old papers, and I found that final eviction notice I had crumpled up and shoved in my pocket. And as I smoothed it out and read it again, I was amazed at how different I felt looking at it, how what had once been a source of terror and shame was now simply a reminder of how far God had brought me, how completely He had turned my situation around, how perfectly He had timed every intervention, every opportunity, every person who had been part of my restoration, and I realized that I wouldn't trade that difficult season for anything, because it had given me something money could never buy: an unshakable confidence in God's faithfulness, an intimate knowledge of His character, a personal testimony of His provision that would encourage my faith for the rest of my life, and could be shared to encourage others who were walking the same difficult road I had traveled. I thought about all the times I had asked God, why me? During those dark months, and now I understood that maybe the better question was, why not me? Because someone had to be the one who would learn these lessons. Someone had to be the one who would experience this kind of breakthrough. Someone had to be the one who would have this testimony to share. Someone had to be the one who would understand what it really means to be provided for by a God who owns everything and loves His children too much to let them stay in places that don't serve their highest good. And I was honored to be that someone, grateful to be that someone, changed forever by being that someone. Because the alternative would have been to miss out on the deepest, richest, most transformative experience of God's love I had ever known. And no amount of financial security could compare to what I had gained in the process of losing everything I thought I needed and finding everything I actually needed in Him. The God who had provided supernaturally for me wasn't a God who only moved in crisis, wasn't a God who only showed up when things were desperate, wasn't a God who was limited to dramatic interventions and last-minute rescues, but was a God who was present in every moment, working in every circumstance, moving in every detail of my life, orchestrating all things for good, even when I couldn't see the good, even when I couldn't understand the plan, even when I couldn't feel His presence, and that revelation changed my entire relationship with him from one of conditional trust, based on immediate answers, to one of unconditional confidence, based on his unchanging character, his proven faithfulness, his perfect love that never fails and never gives up and never lets go. No matter how dark the valley gets, no matter how long the wait seems, no matter how impossible the situation appears, because he is God, and he is good, and he is for me, and he is with me, and that is enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for whatever comes next. If you're reading this story and you're in that place right now where it feels like your needs are screaming louder than your faith, where you're checking your banking app with dread and calculating grocery money in your head and dodging calls from unknown numbers, where you're wondering if God sees your struggle, if he cares about your bills, if he knows how scared you are, if he understands how hard you're trying, if he remembers your name when so many other people seem to have his attention, I want you to know that he does see you, he does care, he does know, he does understand, he does remember, and he's already gone ahead of you to prepare the provision you need, to arrange the encounters that will change everything, to coordinate the breakthrough that will come exactly when you're ready to receive it, exactly when you need it most, exactly when it will accomplish the most good in your life and bring the most glory to his name. Because that's who he is, and that's what he does, and that's how much he loves you. And your current circumstances are not your final destination. Your present lack is not your permanent condition. Your temporary struggle is not your eternal identity. Because you belong to a God who specializes in turning things around, making ways where there are no ways, bringing beauty from ashes and joy from mourning and provision from impossible situations. And he's writing a story in your life that will amaze you when you can see it from the other side. A story of his faithfulness that will encourage your faith for years to come, and will be a testimony to others who need to hear that God still provides, still cares, still intervenes, still rescues, still loves his children too much to leave them in valleys that don't serve their purpose, still moves on behalf of those who trust him even when they can't trace him, even when they can't understand him, even when they can't feel him, because his love is not dependent on their feelings. His provision is not limited by their understanding. His faithfulness is not diminished by their doubts, and his plans for them are good, always good, perfectly good, even when those plans include seasons of difficulty that serve purposes they can't see yet, but will understand someday when they're looking back from the mountaintop he's preparing for them. The provision you need is already in motion, set in place by a God who sees the end from the beginning, who knows exactly what you need and exactly when you'll need it, who has already spoken to the hearts of the people who will be part of your breakthrough, who has already arranged the circumstances that will turn your situation around, who has already prepared the opportunities that will open up exactly when the time is right, and your job is not to figure out how he's going to do it, or when he's going to do it, or through whom he's going to do it. Your job is simply to trust that he will do it, to believe that he's working even when you can't see evidence of his work, to have faith that his timing is perfect even when it doesn't feel timely to you, to remember that his ways are higher than your ways, and his thoughts are higher than your thoughts, and his love for you is deeper than your deepest need and stronger than your strongest fear, and more reliable than anything else you could ever depend on, and that love will see you through this season and into the next one, will carry you from where you are to where you need to be, will provide not just what you need to survive, but what you need to thrive, not just what you need for today, but what you need for tomorrow. Not just what you need financially, but what you need spiritually, emotionally, mentally, and in every other way that matters. Because he is your provider, and he is faithful, and he is good, and he loves you more than you could ever comprehend. And that love is working on your behalf right now, this very moment, arranging your breakthrough, preparing your provision, orchestrating your rescue, writing your testimony. Because that's what love does. That's who he is, and that's the kind of God you serve, a God who never forgets his children, never abandons his promises, never gives up on his people, never stops working on their behalf, never fails to provide exactly what they need, exactly when they need it most. And if you can hold on to that truth, if you can anchor your hope in that reality, if you can rest your faith on that foundation, then you can face whatever comes next with confidence, with peace, with expectation, with joy. Because your story is not over. Your breakthrough is not canceled. Your provision is not delayed. Your miracle is not forgotten. It's all coming together in perfect timing, orchestrated by a perfect God who loves you perfectly and will provide for you perfectly. Because that's who He is, and that's what He does. And that's how this story ends. Not with you defeated by your circumstances, but with you victorious through His provision. Not with you overwhelmed by your needs, but with you amazed by His supply. Not with you questioning His faithfulness, but with you testifying to His goodness. Because He is faithful, and He is good, and He is working everything together for your good and His glory. And you're going to see it. You're going to experience it. You're going to live it. You're going to share it. Because your need isn't too big for His supply. Your timeline isn't more urgent than His wisdom. Your story isn't over. It's just getting to the good part, the part where God shows up and shows off, and shows you exactly what it means to be loved by a God who will never let you down, never let you fall, never let you go, because you are His and He is yours, and nothing can separate you from His love. Nothing can stop His provision. Nothing can cancel His plans for you, and those plans are good, always good, perfectly good, and they're unfolding right now in ways you can see and ways you can't see, in people you know and people you don't know, in opportunities that make sense and opportunities that seem to come out of nowhere. Because that's how God works. That's how provision flows. That's how miracles happen, and yours is coming. Coming soon, coming exactly when you need it most, coming in ways that will amaze you and humble you and change you and use you to encourage others who will find themselves in similar situations. Because that's how the kingdom works. That's how love spreads. That's how testimonies are born. And yours is going to be beautiful, powerful, encouraging, hope-filled, faith-building, God-glorifying. Because you serve a God who makes all things beautiful in His time, who makes all things work together for good, who makes all things possible for those who believe, and you believe, and He knows you believe, and He's honored by your belief, and He's moved by your trust, and He's working because of your faith, working on your behalf, working for your good, working to show you and everyone around you that He is still God, still good, still faithful, still providing, still loving, still rescuing, still making ways where there seem to be none, still writing stories that will be told for generations to come, stories of His faithfulness, His provision, His love, His power, His goodness, His grace. And your story is one of those stories. Your testimony is one of those testimonies. Your breakthrough is one of those breakthroughs. And it's coming, it's here, it's now, it's yours. Because you belong to Him, and He takes care of what belongs to Him. Always, perfectly, completely, lovingly, faithfully. And that's the end of this part of your story and the beginning of the next part, the part where you look back and say, I couldn't pay my bills, but God provided supernaturally. The part where you understand that your need was never too big for His supply. Your situation was never too hard for His intervention. Your circumstances were never beyond His ability to change. Because He is God and you are His, and that's all that matters. That's all you need to know. That's all you need to remember when the next challenge comes, when the next need arises, when the next impossible situation presents itself. Because you'll know who to call, you'll know where to turn, you'll know what to do. You'll remember this story, this testimony, this breakthrough, this provision, this God who never fails, never gives up, never lets go, and you'll face whatever comes next with confidence, with peace, with expectation, with faith. Because you've seen Him work, you've felt His provision, you've experienced His faithfulness, and once you've experienced that, once you've lived that, once you've been carried through impossible circumstances by an impossible God who makes possible what seems impossible, you're never the same. You're never without hope. You're never without help. You're never without Him, and that's enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for whatever comes next in your beautiful, God-written, perfectly provided for life. I woke up the next morning still cold, but somehow different, like something had shifted in the spiritual atmosphere around me during the night, like the dream about the keys had cracked open a door I didn't even know existed. And while my circumstances looked exactly the same, while I was still broke and carless and facing eviction, there was a whisper of hope stirring in my chest that I couldn't explain. couldn't rationalize, couldn't even fully trust yet because hope had disappointed me so many times before. But it was there nonetheless, fragile as a soap bubble but real as the sunrise creeping through my windows. And I found myself getting out of bed with more energy than I'd had in weeks, not because anything had changed externally, but because something had changed internally. Some shift in my spirit that made me want to move, to do something, to engage with life instead of just surviving it. So I decided to clean my house, not because I had guests coming or because cleaning would solve any of my problems, but because I needed something to do with my hands, something to keep me busy while I processed what had happened in that dream, while I tried to understand what those keys might mean, while I waited for whatever was supposed to happen next in this impossible story I was living. I started with my bedroom, making the bed with hospital corners like my grandmother had taught me, organizing the few clothes I had left, and then I moved to the closet, pulling out winter coats I hadn't touched since the weather warmed up, coats that held memories of better times when I could afford to heat my house, when I wore them by choice instead of necessity, when they were fashion statements instead of survival gear. And as I was going through the pockets of my heavy blue coat, the one I'd worn to church last winter when I still felt like I belonged there, when I still felt like someone who had their life together enough to sit in those pews and sing those songs about God's provision with genuine conviction, my hand closed around something crumpled and forgotten, something that had been hiding in that pocket for months, waiting for exactly this moment. And when I pulled it out and smoothed it flat against my palm, I almost started crying right there in my closet because it was a $5 bill, wrinkled and soft from being forgotten. But in that moment it felt like finding buried treasure, like discovering gold in my own backyard, like God had left me a love note in the darkest hour of my need. And I held that $5 like it was made of precious metal, knowing it would buy me eggs and rice, knowing it meant one more meal, one more day, one more small reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as alone in this as I felt. I walked to the grocery store because I couldn't afford gas for a car I didn't have, and the walk gave me time to think about that $5, about how it had been there all along, waiting for me to find it, about how God's provision sometimes comes not as dramatic intervention, but as quiet preparation, as resources placed in our path before we even know we'll need them, as small gifts hidden in plain sight until the moment we're desperate enough to look for them, desperate enough to receive them, desperate enough to recognize them as love letters from heaven disguised as ordinary provision. And as I walked through those automatic doors into the fluorescent brightness of the grocery store, I felt like I was entering sacred space, like this ordinary errand had become a holy mission, like choosing eggs and rice with $5 was somehow an act of faith, a declaration that I still believed in tomorrow even when today felt impossible, still trusted in God's goodness even when His goodness looked different than I'd expected, still hoped for breakthrough even when breakthrough seemed like a fantasy I'd been foolish to entertain. The checkout line moved slowly, giving me time to count and recount my $5, to calculate tax, to make sure I could afford what I'd chosen. And as I stood there watching other people buy cartloads of food without a second thought, I felt the familiar sting of shame trying to creep in, the voice that wanted to remind me how far I'd fallen, how much I'd lost, how little I had compared to everyone around me. But then I remembered the dream, remembered the keys, remembered the voice that had called me child and promised I was going to need those keys soon. And instead of shame, I felt something that surprised me, something that felt almost like gratitude, not gratitude for being broke, not gratitude for struggling, but gratitude for being seen, for being remembered, for being loved enough to have provision placed in my path even when I was too overwhelmed to. Notice it at first, and when the cashier smiled at me and said, "Having a good day?" I realized that somehow, impossibly, I actually was, that finding $5 in my coat pocket had done more than provide for my immediate need. It had reminded me that I was held by hands bigger than my problems, carried by love deeper than my circumstances, watched over by eyes that never close and never forget, and never stop working on behalf of the children they love. I was walking home with my small bag of groceries, feeling lighter than I had in weeks despite carrying the same burdens I'd woken up with, when I saw a woman about my age, struggling with an overstuffed purse and multiple shopping bags. And as she juggled everything trying to get to her car, her wallet slipped out of her purse and fell to the ground, spilling its contents across the asphalt, including a $20 bill that fluttered in the breeze like a green leaf. And without thinking, I picked up the bill and gathered the scattered cards and receipts, tapping her on the shoulder as she was loading her bags into her trunk. "Excuse me, you dropped this." And I held out her wallet and the 20, expecting her to thank me and take her money back, expecting this to be just a simple good deed in an otherwise difficult day. But instead, she turned around and looked at me with such kindness in her eyes, such genuine warmth and recognition, that I felt like she could see straight through to my soul, like she knew exactly what I was going through without me saying a word. And she said, "Keep it, honey. God told me you need it more than I do." And I tried to protest, tried to explain that I couldn't take her money, that I'd just been returning what belonged to her. But she insisted with a firmness that felt like divine authority, like she was delivering a message from heaven itself. "I know what it's like, sweetie. I've been exactly where you are, and someone did this exact same thing for me 5 years ago when I needed it most. And now it's your turn to receive. Your turn to let someone else be the hands and feet of God's provision in your life. Your turn to accept help without shame, without guilt, without feeling like you have to earn it or deserve it or pay it back. Because that's not how grace works. That's not how love works. That's not how God's kingdom operates." She squeezed my hand as she placed that $20 bill in my palm, her fingers warm and soft and somehow familiar. Like maybe I'd dreamed about this moment, like maybe this encounter had been arranged before I was even born, orchestrated by a God who sees the beginning from the end and coordinates the movements of strangers to deliver exactly what his children need exactly when they need it most. And she said, "I don't know what you're going through, but I can see it in your eyes, that look of someone who's been fighting battles nobody else can see, someone who's been trying so hard to hold it together that they've forgotten what it feels like to fall apart safely. Someone who's been carrying burdens that are too heavy for one person to carry alone. And I want you to know that you're not alone, that God sees you, that he knows where you are and what you need. And sometimes he uses broken people to help other broken people, uses people who've been rescued to participate in someone else's rescue, uses ordinary encounters to deliver extraordinary grace. And that's what this is. That's what's happening right here in this parking lot between two strangers who aren't really strangers. Because we're both daughters of the same Father who takes care of his children in ways that don't always make sense to the natural mind, but always make perfect sense to the heart that's learning to trust his goodness. I stood there in that grocery store parking lot with tears streaming down my face, holding $25 total, more money than I'd seen in weeks, but crying not because of the money, though that was overwhelming and wonderful and desperately needed, but because of what she'd said about knowing what it was like, about being where I was, about someone doing this for her when she needed it most. Because in that moment I realized I wasn't the first person to walk this road of financial desperation and spiritual questioning, wasn't the only one who'd struggled to reconcile faith and crisis, wasn't alone in the shame and fear and desperate prayers that had consumed my life for months, and there was something so healing about being seen by someone who truly understood. Someone who'd walked through her own valley and come out the other side with enough compassion to recognize someone else still walking through theirs. Someone who'd been rescued and remembered what rescue felt like and wanted to participate. In someone else's rescue, someone who'd learned that God's provision often comes through human hands, through ordinary people who are willing to be extraordinary vessels of his love and grace and generosity. I made it exactly 3 steps toward my car before the tears started coming in earnest. Big, ugly tears that came from somewhere deep inside, tears of relief and gratitude and wonder, tears that had been building up for months and finally had permission to fall, tears that washed away some of the shame I'd been carrying, some of the fear that had been choking me, some of the doubt that had been whispering lies about God's love and faithfulness and concern for my daily needs. And I sat in my car in that parking lot and cried for 10 minutes, not caring who saw me, not caring who might think I was having a breakdown, because maybe I was having a breakdown, a breaking down of all the walls I'd built around my heart to protect it from disappointment, a breaking down of all the pride that had kept me from receiving help, a breaking down of all the lies that had convinced me I was alone and forgotten and beyond the reach of divine intervention. And as those walls crumbled and that pride dissolved and those lies lost their power, I felt something I hadn't felt in months, something that felt like hope but deeper, something that felt like peace but stronger, something that felt like love but more personal, more intimate, more real than anything I'd experienced in the religious services and Bible studies and prayer meetings where I'd tried so hard to manufacture the kind of faith that would move mountains when all I really needed was the kind of faith that would help me believe God cared about my grocery money, my electric bill, my broken down car, my overdue rent, my everyday, ordinary, desperate human needs that felt too small to bother heaven with, but were too big for me to handle alone. When I finally stopped crying and started the drive home, I felt different, not because my circumstances had changed, though having $25 instead of 0 was definitely an improvement, but because something had shifted in my understanding of how God works, how He provides, how He shows up in the lives of His children, not always in dramatic supernatural interventions that make headlines and fill testimony services, but often in quiet, ordinary moments that look like coincidence but feel like miracle, moments when strangers become angels, when lost money becomes found hope, when simple kindness becomes profound provision, when human compassion becomes divine communication, when God whispers, "I see you, I know where you are, I haven't forgotten you, I'm working on your behalf, even when you can't see my hand, even when you can't trace my movement, even when you can't understand my timing, because my love for you is bigger than your circumstances. My plans for you are larger than your problems. My provision for you is more creative than your imagination. And what looks like delay to you is actually perfect orchestration to me. And what feels like abandonment to you is actually preparation for breakthrough that will amaze you when you can finally see the whole picture from the other side." I cooked those eggs that night like they were a feast prepared for royalty, seasoned that rice like it was a gourmet meal crafted by master chefs, and ate dinner by candlelight. Not because it was romantic, but because I still didn't have electricity. But somehow that meal tasted different than any I'd eaten in months, seasoned with gratitude that transformed simple ingredients into something sacred, something that felt like communion, like a holy moment between me and the God who saw my need and met it in ways I never could have expected, never could have orchestrated, never could have imagined. And as I sat there, eating by the flickering light of candles I'd found in a junk drawer, I found myself praying differently than I had in months, not begging or pleading or bargaining or demanding, but simply saying, "Thank you, God. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible. Thank you for the $5 in my coat pocket that you placed there months ago, knowing I would need it today. Thank you for the woman in the parking lot who was willing to be your hands and feet and voice in my life. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone in this struggle, that other people have walked this road and survived it, that you use broken people to help other broken people, that your provision comes in all shapes and sizes and through all kinds of unexpected channels. And thank you for beginning to show me that your silence wasn't abandonment, but preparation, that your delay wasn't denial, but perfect timing, that your love for me is so much bigger and deeper and more creative than I ever understood. And I'm starting to trust you again, starting to hope again, starting to believe again that somehow, some way, you're going to see me through this season and into whatever comes next." The power was still out, the car was still broken, the eviction notice was still crumpled in my pocket, but something fundamental had shifted in my heart, not because my problems had been solved, but because I'd been reminded that I wasn't solving them alone, that there were hands bigger than mine working on my behalf, that there was love deeper than my circumstances surrounding me, that there was hope larger than my current reality carrying me, and that knowledge, that assurance, that growing confidence in God's goodness and faithfulness had become more valuable than electricity, more precious than transportation, more powerful than any external provision I could receive, because it was changing me from the inside out, transforming me from someone who was desperately trying to survive circumstances into someone who was learning to thrive in the midst of them, not because the circumstances were pleasant, but because the God who was walking through them with me was good, always good, perfectly good, even when His goodness looked different than I'd expected, even when His provision came in ways I wouldn't have chosen, even when His timing didn't match my timeline. because his ways are higher than my ways, and his thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and his love for me is deeper than my deepest need, and stronger than my strongest fear, and more reliable than anything else I could ever depend on. And that love was working on my behalf, right now, this very moment, in ways I could see and ways I couldn't see, through people I knew and people I didn't know, in circumstances that made sense and circumstances that seemed to come out of nowhere. Because that's how God works, that's how provision flows, that's how miracles happen in the lives of ordinary people who are learning to recognize extraordinary grace in everyday encounters. And I was one of those people. I was living one of those stories. I was experiencing one of those miracles. And it was just the beginning, just the first glimpse of breakthrough, just the initial evidence that heaven hadn't forgotten my address after all, that God was preparing something bigger than I could imagine, something better than I could ask for, something perfectly timed and perfectly orchestrated and perfectly designed to meet not just my immediate needs but my deepest longings, my heart's cry for security and hope and evidence that I was loved and seen and remembered by the God who holds the whole world in his hands and somehow still has room in his heart to care about my grocery money, my electric bill, my everyday, ordinary, desperate human needs that matter to him. Because I matter to him, because that's who he is, because that's what love does, because that's how this story was always going to end, not with me defeated by circumstances, but with me amazed by provision, not with me questioning his faithfulness, but with me testifying to his goodness, not with me lost in the valley, but with me standing on the mountain looking back at every step of the journey with wonder and gratitude and absolute certainty that every single moment, even the darkest ones, even the most difficult ones, even the ones that felt like abandonment, were actually part of a perfect plan orchestrated by a perfect God who loves his children perfectly and provides for them perfectly in ways that are always good, always right, always exactly what they need exactly when they need it most, even when they can't see it, even when they can't understand it, even when they can't believe it, because his love doesn't depend on their understanding. His provision doesn't require their comprehension. His faithfulness doesn't need their approval. It just is, constant and unchanging and reliable as the sunrise. And that truth was beginning to dawn in my heart like the first light of morning after the longest night of my life, bringing with it the promise that this darkness was temporary. This struggle had an expiration date. This season of lack was actually a season of preparation for abundance I couldn't yet imagine. Abundance that would come not just in material provision, but in spiritual understanding, in deeper faith, in stronger character, in more authentic compassion, in the kind of testimony that could only be forged in the furnace of desperate dependence on a God who proves himself faithful to those who dare to trust him. When trusting him makes no sense to anyone else, when trusting him requires them to hope against hope, when trusting him means believing in breakthrough they can't see, provision they can't calculate, miracles they can't manufacture, but that he can and will and is already orchestrating on their behalf. Because that's who he is, and that's what he does, and that's how much he loves his children, all of them, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones, particularly the ones who feel like they've fallen too far and failed too often and lost too much to ever be worthy of rescue. Because worthiness was never the qualification for receiving his love, his grace, his provision, his miraculous intervention in impossible circumstances. The only qualification is need. And I had plenty of that, more than enough to qualify for everything he wanted to give, everything he was preparing to pour out, everything he was already setting in motion through encounters I couldn't orchestrate, through people I hadn't met yet, through opportunities I couldn't imagine, through doors I didn't even know existed. Because he goes before his children to prepare the way, because he works all things together for their good, because he never wastes a tear, never ignores a prayer, never forgets a promise, never abandons a child, never gives up on a story, never stops working on behalf of those who belong to him. And I belong to him, completely and utterly and eternally, and that belonging was about to be demonstrated in ways that would leave me speechless with wonder, overwhelmed with gratitude, transformed by grace, and forever changed by the realization that the God I serve is not just the God of the universe, but the God of my grocery money, not just the God of cosmic events, but the God of my electric bill, not just the God of theological concepts, but the God of my everyday, ordinary, desperate human needs. And he was about to prove it in ways that would make me laugh and cry and worship and wonder and never doubt his goodness again. Because once you've experienced that kind of personal, intimate, perfectly timed provision, once you've seen that kind of supernatural intervention in natural circumstances, once you've felt that kind of love expressed through human kindness and divine orchestration, you're never the same. You're never without hope. You're never without help. You're never without him. And that's enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for whatever comes next in this beautiful, God-written, perfectly provided for life. 3 days later, I was walking to the store again, still conserving every penny by choosing my feet over bus fare, still living day by day but carrying considerably more hope than I'd had since this whole nightmare began. When I spotted a familiar face coming toward me on the sidewalk, Sister Margaret from my church, a woman I'd exchanged maybe 5 conversations with in the 2 years I'd been attending there, always polite Sunday morning pleasantries, but nothing deep, nothing personal, nothing that would have given her any insight into the private hell I'd been living through these past months. And normally, I might have crossed the street to avoid an awkward conversation about how I was doing when the honest answer would have required more vulnerability than I was ready to share with someone I barely knew. But something made me keep walking straight. Maybe it was the growing sense that coincidences weren't really coincidences anymore. Maybe it was the new awareness that God had been orchestrating encounters I couldn't see. Maybe it was just the remnant of hope from the parking lot miracle still glowing in my chest. And when we were close enough to make eye contact, she called out my name with such purpose, such intentionality, that I knew immediately this wasn't going to be a casual encounter, wasn't going to be surface-level small talk about weather and church services, but something deeper, something that felt like divine appointment disguised as random meeting. "I am so glad I ran into you," she said, reaching into her purse with movements that seemed urgent, almost frantic, like she'd been carrying something for me and was relieved to finally deliver it. "This is going to sound completely strange, and I hope you don't think I'm losing my mind. But God has been putting you on my heart for days, waking me up in the middle of the night with your name on his lips, showing me your face during prayer time, pressing your need into my spirit during worship, and he told me very clearly to give you this." And she pulled out a white envelope that looked thick, substantial, important, and held it toward me with the kind of determination that comes from someone who's learned to recognize God's voice and obey it even when it doesn't make sense to their natural mind, even when it requires them to approach virtual strangers with unusual requests, even when it means stepping out of their comfort zone to be the hands and feet of divine provision in someone else's life. I tried to step back, tried to politely decline, tried to say, "Oh, Sister Margaret, that's incredibly kind," but I couldn't possibly accept. Because something about the envelope, about the weight of it, about the way she was holding it, told me this wasn't a $20 bill or a small gesture of kindness. This was something significant, something substantial, something that would represent sacrifice on her part and obligation on mine. And I'd been raised to believe that accepting help was a sign of weakness, that needing assistance was evidence of failure, that proper people solved their own problems without burdening others with their struggles. But she pushed that envelope into my hands with a firmness that surprised me, with an authority that felt supernatural, with a conviction that made it clear this wasn't really a request, but a divine mandate she was fulfilling. And she said, "Honey, I need you to listen to me very carefully, because what I'm about to tell you might be the most important thing you hear this year, and I need you to receive it not just in your head, but in your heart, not just with your mind, but with your spirit, because God wants you to understand something about how his kingdom works, something about how his love operates, something about how his provision flows from one generation to another, from one broken person to another broken person, from someone who's been rescued to someone who needs rescuing." She looked me directly in the eyes with the kind of intensity that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world, like nothing else matters except this moment, this conversation, this exchange that was happening on a sidewalk, but felt like it was taking place in the throne room of heaven. And she continued, 5 years ago, I was exactly where you are right now. Maybe not the same circumstances, maybe not the same specific struggles, but the same desperation, the same fear, the same shame, the same sense that I was drowning and nobody could see me going under. The same exhaustion from trying to hold it all together when everything was falling apart. The same questions about whether God really cared about my everyday problems, whether his promises applied to someone like me, whether his provision extended to ordinary people with extraordinary needs. And I was walking through the grocery store one day, counting pennies and calculating calories and trying to make $3 stretch into a meal that would feed my family, when a woman I'd never seen before approached me and handed me an envelope just like this one. And when I tried to refuse it, she said exactly what I'm saying to you now. This isn't charity, this isn't pity, this isn't about your worthiness or your ability to pay it back. This is about God's heart for his children. This is about kingdom economics that don't operate according to earthly principles. This is about love being passed from one person to another until it reaches exactly the person who needs it exactly when they need it most. And that person today is you. The envelope felt warm in my hands, heavy with more than just its contents, weighted with meaning and purpose and divine orchestration, and I could feel tears starting to build behind my eyes, because something about her words, something about the way she was looking at me, something about the timing of this encounter told me this was bigger than random kindness, deeper than human compassion, more significant than one person helping another. This was God moving through ordinary circumstances to accomplish extraordinary purposes. This was heaven touching earth in the most practical possible way. This was the supernatural dressed up as the natural. And Sister Margaret seemed to sense what I was feeling, because she reached out and squeezed my free hand and said, "I don't know the details of what you're going through, but I can see it in your eyes, that look of someone who's been fighting battles nobody else understands, someone who's been carrying burdens that are too heavy for one person to bear, someone who's been trusting God through circumstances that make trusting him feel impossible. And I want you to know that he sees every tear you've cried, knows every prayer you've whispered, understands every fear that keeps you awake at night, and he's been orchestrating this moment since before you even knew you would need it, coordinating events and encounters and people and resources to make sure that exactly what you need would be delivered to you exactly when you're ready to receive it. And you're ready now, ready to let someone else be the answer to your prayers, ready to accept help without shame, ready to receive love without feeling like you have to earn it or deserve it or pay it back immediately." I stood there on that sidewalk with tears streaming down my face, holding an envelope I was afraid to open, because I could already sense it contained more than money, contained hope and validation and evidence that I hadn't been forgotten by heaven after all, that my prayers hadn't been bouncing off the ceiling, but had been traveling straight to the heart of a God who was already working on my behalf in ways I couldn't see, through people I didn't know, in circumstances I couldn't have imagined. And Sister Margaret smiled at me with the kind of warmth that only comes from someone who's been where you are and remembers what rescue feels like. And she said, "When you're in a position to help someone else, and you will be sooner than you think, you'll remember this moment. You'll remember what it felt like to receive unexpected grace, and you'll understand that this is how God's family takes care of each other. This is how his provision circulates through his people. This is how love becomes practical, how faith becomes tangible, how hope becomes transferable from one generation to another. And you'll find yourself approaching some other struggling person with an envelope or a gift card or a helping hand, and you'll say the same words I'm saying to you now. This isn't charity. This is kingdom. This is how we do family in the house of God. This is love with skin on it, and it's your turn to receive it, your turn to be blessed by it, your turn to let it change not just your circumstances, but your understanding of who God is and how much he loves his children and how far he'll go to make sure they're taken care of, even when they can't take care of themselves, especially when they can't take care of themselves, particularly when they've exhausted every resource and explored every option and tried every strategy, and still found themselves facing impossible situations that require supernatural intervention. She hugged me right there on the sidewalk, a long embrace that felt like blessing, like benediction, like the physical expression of God's love being wrapped around me by human arms. And when she finally stepped back, she said, "Go home and open that envelope in private. Let yourself feel whatever you need to feel. Cry if you need to cry, laugh if you need to laugh, worship if you need to worship, but don't you dare feel guilty about receiving what God wants to give you. Don't you dare apologize for needing help. Don't you dare diminish this gift by thinking you don't deserve it, because deserve has nothing to do with it. Love has everything to do with it, and you are loved more than you know, more than you can imagine, more than your circumstances would suggest. And this envelope is just the beginning. Just the first evidence of breakthrough that's been building in the spiritual realm while you've been struggling in the natural realm. And what you're about to experience is going to restore your faith, not just in God's provision, but in His character, His timing, His love, His commitment to His children, His willingness to move heaven and earth to make sure they have what they need when they need it most. I walked home in a daze, clutching that envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe. And maybe it did. Maybe the secret was simply that God's love is more practical than we realize, more personal than we understand, more present than we feel, more powerful than our circumstances, more persistent than our doubts, more perfect than our timing. And when I finally got inside my house and sat down at my kitchen table and opened that envelope with trembling hands, I found $400 in cash, $400 that represented rent money and utility deposits and grocery money and breathing room and hope made tangible and prayer answered in the most concrete possible way. $400 that proved Sister Margaret hadn't been exaggerating when she said this was kingdom provision, divine economics, supernatural supply for natural needs. And I held those bills in my hands and laughed and cried at the same time. Laughed because it was almost too good to be true, too perfectly timed, too exactly what I needed. And cried because it was real. It was happening. It was God's hand moving in my circumstances in ways I couldn't deny, couldn't rationalize away, couldn't attribute to coincidence or luck or human kindness alone, because the timing was too perfect, the amount was too precise, the delivery was too orchestrated for this to be anything other than supernatural intervention in my natural circumstances. I called my landlord that afternoon, my heart pounding with the surreal reality of being able to say, I can pay my rent today, including the late fees. And I'll never forget the surprise in his voice, the way he paused for a long moment before saying, well, that's great news. I was really hoping we could work something out. I didn't want to have to proceed with the eviction. And when I hung up the phone, I felt like I'd just been handed my life back, like I'd been given a reprieve from a sentence I'd been dreading, like I'd been pulled back from a cliff I'd been dangerously close to falling over, and the relief wasn't just financial, wasn't just about keeping my house. It was emotional, spiritual, psychological, the relief of knowing I wasn't as alone as I'd felt, wasn't as forgotten as I'd feared, wasn't as hopeless as my circumstances had suggested. Because if God could orchestrate this, if He could move in Sister Margaret's heart to give sacrificially to someone she barely knew, if He could coordinate our paths to cross at exactly the right moment with exactly the right provision, then what else was He orchestrating that I couldn't see yet? What other doors was He opening that I hadn't walked through yet? What other opportunities was He preparing that I couldn't imagine yet? What other breakthroughs was He arranging that would continue to amaze me with His goodness, His faithfulness, His perfect timing, His supernatural love expressed through natural means? The power company was equally surprised when I called to arrange restoration of service, and when the technician came out that evening and flipped whatever switches needed to be flipped to bring electricity back to my house, I stood in my living room and turned on every light, not because I needed that much illumination, but because I wanted to celebrate, wanted to acknowledge this moment, wanted to mark this transition from darkness to light, from despair to hope, from feeling abandoned to feeling embraced by a God who hadn't been absent from my story, but had been writing chapters I couldn't read yet, orchestrating plot twists I couldn't anticipate, preparing an ending I couldn't imagine. And as I walked through my house flipping switches and watching bulbs burst to life, I felt like I was doing more than restoring electricity. I was participating in resurrection, witnessing the power that brings dead things back to life, that takes what seems hopeless and infuses it with possibility, that transforms what looks like endings into new beginnings. And I realized that this wasn't just about paying bills, wasn't just about practical provision. This was about God revealing his character to me in ways I could touch and taste and see and experience, showing me that he's not just the God of spiritual things, but the God of material things, not just the God of eternal concerns, but the God of immediate needs, not just the God of theological concepts, but the God of electric bills and rent payments and grocery money and all the ordinary expenses that make up real life for real people, in real situations that require real solutions from a real God who really cares about every detail of his children's lives. That night, I went grocery shopping for the first time in months without anxiety, without calculating every purchase, without the familiar knot in my stomach that had become my constant companion during every transaction. And I filled my cart with actual meals instead of just survival rations, with fresh vegetables and fruit and bread and milk and all the ordinary things that had become luxuries in my world of scarcity. And when I reached the checkout line and handed over cash instead of counting change, the cashier smiled and said, "Looks like you're stocking up for something special." And I wanted to tell her, yes, I'm stocking up for hope. I'm buying ingredients for faith. I'm purchasing supplies for a new chapter of my life where I remember that I'm held by hands bigger than my problems, loved by a heart deeper than my circumstances, watched over by eyes that never close and never stop working on behalf of the children they adore. But instead, I just smiled back and said something like that. Because how do you explain to a stranger that your grocery cart represents resurrection, that your ability to buy food without fear represents breakthrough, that this ordinary trip to an ordinary store represents extraordinary intervention by an extraordinary God who specializes in making the impossible possible, the supernatural natural, the miraculous mundane? Because that's how he works. That's how provision flows. That's how love becomes practical and faith becomes tangible and hope becomes transferable from one person to another until it reaches exactly the person who needs it exactly when they need it most. The job interview call came 2 days later. Another application I'd submitted months ago and completely forgotten about. Another door I'd knocked on when I was first starting to panic about money. Another opportunity I'd written off as a dead end when I didn't hear back immediately. But here it was, calling me exactly when I needed it most, offering me not just temporary work, but a permanent position with steady income and health benefits, and the kind of stability I'd taken for granted before and would never take for granted again. And when I walked into that office building for the interview, wearing my best clothes, which weren't saying much but were clean and pressed and hopeful, I felt different than I had in months, not just because my immediate crisis had been addressed, though that was certainly part of it, but because I'd experienced firsthand what it meant to be carried through impossible circumstances by a God who specializes in making ways where there seem to be none, who turns dead ends into doorways, who transforms valleys into mountaintops, who uses ordinary people to deliver extraordinary grace. And that experience had given me a confidence that had nothing to do with my resume or my qualifications or my ability to interview well, and everything to do with my growing understanding that I was loved and valued and watched over by someone much bigger than any employer, much more powerful than any circumstance, much more faithful than any human institution. And that knowledge, that assurance, that quiet confidence in God's goodness and provision must have shown in the interview. Because I got the job, not just any job, but the right job. The job that would not only meet my financial needs, but would challenge me professionally, connect me with people who would become friends, provide opportunities for growth and advancement. I couldn't have imagined when I was sitting in my dark house eating cold soup and yelling at God about his apparent absence from my circumstances. As I sat in my car after the interview, looking at the building where I would be working, remembering the dream I'd had weeks ago about someone handing me keys, I realized that maybe those keys weren't literal house keys, but symbolic keys. Keys to provision, keys to breakthrough, keys to understanding how God works in the lives of his children, keys to a deeper faith that could weather any storm because it was built not on my ability to figure things out, but on his ability to work all things together for good. And I pulled out my phone and called Sister Margaret to thank her again, to tell her about the job, to let her know that her obedience to God's prompting had been the catalyst for a whole series of miracles, the first domino in a chain reaction of provision that was still unfolding. still surprising me, still reminding me that I served a God who was always working, always moving, always orchestrating, always providing, even when I couldn't see his hand, even when I couldn't trace his movement, even when I couldn't understand his methods, because his ways are higher than my ways, and his thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and his love for me is deeper than my deepest need, and stronger than my strongest fear, and more reliable than anything else I could ever depend on. And that love was continuing to work on my behalf, continuing to open doors, continuing to arrange encounters, continuing to provide in ways that were perfectly timed and perfectly suited to my specific needs, and perfectly designed to increase my faith, expand my understanding, and prepare me for whatever came next in this beautiful story he was writing with my life. On my first day at the new job, I found a church bulletin from the previous Sunday folded in my jacket pocket, and when I unfolded it during my lunch break, my eyes immediately went to the verse printed in bold at the bottom of the page, "And my God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus." Philippians 4:19. And for the first time since this whole journey began, that verse didn't feel like a promise I was desperately trying to claim or a hope I was clinging to with white knuckles. It felt like a truth I had experienced, a reality I had lived, a guarantee I could count on, not because I understood how it worked, but because I had seen it work, had felt its power, had received its blessing in ways I never could have imagined or orchestrated or manufactured. And I realized that God hadn't been late in his provision. He had been precise, arriving exactly when I needed him most, exactly when I was ready to receive what he wanted to give, exactly when I could recognize his hand and give him glory for what he had done. And that precision, that perfect timing, that supernatural coordination of natural events was proof that I was loved by a God who pays attention to details, who cares about timing, who orchestrates encounters, who moves in the hearts of people, who provides through human vessels, who makes ways where there seem to be no ways, who turns impossible situations into testimonies of his faithfulness, his goodness, his love, his power, his provision. And I was living one of those testimonies, experiencing one of those miracles, witnessing one of those impossible made possible stories that would encourage my faith for the rest of my life and could be shared to strengthen others who were walking similar roads of difficulty and doubt and desperate dependence on a God who proves himself faithful to those who dare to trust him. When trusting him makes no sense to anyone else, when trusting him requires believing in provision they can't see, breakthrough they can't calculate, miracles they can't manufacture, but that he can and will and does orchestrate on behalf of his children, because that's who he is, that's what he does, that's how much he loves us, and that love was about to be demonstrated in even more amazing ways as this story continued to unfold, as this testimony continued to be written, as this journey continued to reveal new depths of God's character, new dimensions of his faithfulness, new expressions of his provision. Because what I'd experienced so far was just the beginning, just the first act in a drama of divine intervention that would continue to amaze me, humble me, change me, and use me to encourage others who needed to know that God still provides, still cares, still intervenes, still rescues, still loves his children too much to leave them in valleys that don't serve their ultimate good. And he was about to prove it again in ways that would exceed my ability to ask or think or imagine. Because that's what he does. That's who he is. That's how this story was always going to unfold, with breakthrough following breakthrough, with provision following provision, with miracle following miracle, until there was no doubt left that I was held by hands that would never let me fall, loved by a heart that would never give up on me, watched over by eyes that would never stop working on my behalf, because I belong to him, and he takes care of what belongs to him, always, perfectly, completely, lovingly. And that was just the beginning of understanding what it really means to be a child of the King, to be loved by the Creator, to be provided for by the God who owns everything and shares everything with his children who learn to trust him, who dare to depend on him, who choose to believe in his goodness even when circumstances suggest otherwise. Because his goodness isn't dependent on circumstances, his provision isn't limited by natural resources, his love isn't diminished by human understanding, and his plans for his children are always good, always perfect, always exactly what they need exactly when they need it most, and I was about to discover just how good, just how perfect, just how precisely timed his plans for me really were. 6 months later, I was sitting in the same living room where I'd yelled at God in the darkness, but now the lights were on, and the bills were paid, and there was food in the refrigerator, and peace in my heart. And the most remarkable thing wasn't that my circumstances had changed, though they certainly had. It was that I had changed, that the person paying those bills was fundamentally different from the person who had been unable to pay them, not because I was making more money or had better budgeting skills, though both of those things were true, but because I had learned something about God's character that could only be learned in the furnace of financial crisis, something about his timing that could only be understood from the perspective of someone who had waited in desperation and received in perfect precision, something about his provision that went far deeper than money and touched the core of who I was and who I was becoming in him. And that transformation, that inner revolution, that complete reordering of my understanding of God's love and faithfulness and commitment to his children had become more valuable than any amount of financial security I could achieve, more precious than any job stability I could attain, more powerful than any external provision I could receive, because it had changed not just what I had but who I was, not just my bank balance but my heart's balance, not just my ability to pay bills but my capacity to trust God with every aspect of my life, knowing that he who had carried me through the valley would continue to carry me up the mountain. And that knowledge had become the foundation of a faith that could weather any storm, survive any crisis, endure any difficulty, because it was built not on my circumstances, but on his character, not on my ability to understand his ways, but on his commitment to work all things together for my good, not on my capacity to figure out solutions, but on his power to create solutions I could never imagine, never orchestrate, never manufacture on my own. When my bank balance got low now, which it still did sometimes because life is life, and unexpected expenses still happen and financial margin is something I was still learning to build and maintain, I didn't panic the way I used to. Didn't lie awake at night calculating and recalculating numbers that never added up the way I wanted them to. Didn't avoid looking at my banking app or screening my calls or hiding from my mail. Because I had experienced firsthand what it meant to be carried by a God who specializes in impossible situations, who makes ways where there are no ways, who provides for his children not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually and in every way they need to be provided for. And that experience had given me a peace that surpassed understanding, a confidence that transcended circumstances, a security that was rooted not in my account balance, but in my account standing with a God who loved me too much to let me fall, too much to abandon me in difficulty, too much to leave me in any situation that didn't ultimately serve my highest good and his greatest glory. And when low balances came now, instead of panic, I felt anticipation. Instead of fear, I felt expectation. Instead of dread, I felt curiosity about how God was going to move this time, what door he was going to open, what person he was going to use, what opportunity he was going to create, what miracle he was going to perform. Because I had learned that my God was not just the God of one-time rescue, but the God of ongoing provision, not just the God of crisis intervention, but the God of daily supply, not just the God of dramatic breakthrough, but the God of consistent faithfulness. And knowing that, really knowing that deep in my soul, had changed everything about how I approached money, how I viewed security, how I defined success, how I measured wealth, how I understood abundance. Because I had discovered that true abundance wasn't about having enough money to feel safe. It was about having enough faith to feel secure, regardless of how much money I had. Enough trust to rest in God's goodness, regardless of my circumstances. Enough confidence in his character to believe that he would provide exactly what I needed, exactly when I needed it, even if that provision came in ways I didn't expect, through channels I didn't recognize, at times that didn't match my preferred timeline. Because his ways are higher than my ways, and his thoughts are higher than my thoughts, and his love for me is deeper than my deepest need and more reliable than any earthly security I could ever achieve. I started volunteering at the local food bank, the same one where I had stood in line just months earlier, too proud to make eye contact too. Ashamed to admit I needed help, too broken to believe that things could ever be different, And now I was on the other side of the table, looking into faces that reflected my own journey, recognizing the mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that I knew so well, understanding the courage it took to walk through those doors and ask for help, remembering the shame that came with needing assistance, the fear that came with not knowing where the next meal would come from, the desperation that drove people to swallow their pride and accept charity from strangers. And I found that I could speak hope into their situations, not because I had all the answers, but because I had lived the questions, not because I had never struggled, but because I had struggled and been carried through, not because I was naturally gifted at encouragement, but because I had been encouraged by God in ways that made me want to pass that encouragement along to others who needed it as desperately as I once had. And there was something sacred about being able to hand someone a bag of groceries and say, "I know what this feels like. I know how hard it is to be here. I know the courage it took to walk through those doors. And I want you to know that this is temporary, that things can change, that God sees you and hasn't forgotten you and is working on your behalf even when you can't see His hand, even when you can't understand His timing, even when you can't feel His presence. Because I've been exactly where you are, and I've seen how He moves, how He provides, how He transforms impossible situations into testimonies of His faithfulness. And you're going to have one of those testimonies too. You're going to look back on this season and see how He was working all along, how He was orchestrating encounters and opportunities and breakthroughs that will amaze you when you can finally see the whole picture from the other side. I started what I called God's drawer in my kitchen, a simple wooden drawer where I put $10 every week, money set aside specifically for the next person who would need it, money that represented my faith in God's continued provision, my understanding that I had been blessed to be a blessing, my recognition that what I had received wasn't just for my own benefit, but was supposed to flow through me to others who were walking the same difficult road I had traveled. And that drawer became my way of partnering with God in His provision for others, my way of being part of the answer to someone else's desperate prayers, my way of participating in the kind of miracle I had experienced. Because I had learned that God's provision often comes through human hands, through ordinary people who are willing to be extraordinary vessels of His love and grace and generosity, and I wanted to be one of those people, wanted to be available to be used by Him, wanted to be ready when He whispered in my spirit, "There's someone who needs what you have, someone who's drowning the way you were drowning, someone who needs to know they're not forgotten, not alone, not beyond the reach of divine intervention." And the first time I had to make a withdrawal from that drawer, it was to slip a grocery gift card under the windshield wiper of a car where I could see someone crying behind the steering wheel, someone who looked exactly like I had looked months earlier, someone whose body language spoke of desperation and fear and the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting battles nobody else can see. And as I walked away from that car, I realized that God had turned me from someone who needed provision into someone who could provide, from someone who was desperate for miracles into someone who could be part of someone else's miracle, from someone who had been rescued into someone who could participate in rescue, and that transformation was worth more than all the money in the world because it connected me to God's heart in ways I had never experienced before, made me a partner in His work rather than just a recipient of His grace, showed me that His blessings aren't meant to stop with us, but are meant to flow through us to others who need to experience the same love, the same provision, the same hope, the same breakthrough that changed our lives and can change theirs too. The shame that had wrapped around me like chains during my financial crisis was completely gone, replaced by a confidence that had nothing to do with my bank balance and everything to do with my understanding of God's love, His faithfulness, His commitment to His children, His willingness to move heaven and earth to make sure they have what they need when they need it most. And I found that I could talk openly about my struggles now, could share my story without embarrassment, could admit. When I was going through difficult times without feeling like I was admitting failure, because I had learned that needing help wasn't a sign of weakness, but an opportunity for God to show His strength, that financial struggle wasn't evidence of spiritual failure, but sometimes the very classroom where spiritual growth happens, that asking for prayer wasn't admitting defeat, but acknowledging that we were never meant to walk through life alone, that we are part of a body where each member supports the others, where each person's struggle becomes an opportunity for others to show love, where each victory becomes a testimony to God's goodness that encourages everyone who hears it. And I had gone from being someone who hid their struggles to someone who shared them freely, not to seek pity, but to offer hope, not to gain sympathy, but to give testimony, not to burden others, but to bless them with the knowledge that God is still in the miracle business, still providing for his children, still working in impossible circumstances, still turning stories of desperation into testimonies of his faithfulness. And my story had become one of those testimonies. My experience had become one of those encouragements. My journey had become one of those examples that could strengthen the faith of others who were walking through their own valleys, facing their own giants, fighting their own battles, wondering if God really saw them, really cared about their daily needs, really understood their fears and frustrations and desperate longings for breakthrough that seemed to take forever to come. My identity had shifted in the most fundamental way possible, from someone who was defined by what I could accomplish, what I could afford, what I could manage on my own, to someone who was defined by how much I was loved by God, how perfectly he provided for me, how completely he could be trusted with every aspect of my life, how thoroughly he had proven his faithfulness in my darkest hour. And that shift changed everything about how I approached relationships, work, money, prayer, worship, service, and every other area of my existence. Because when you know deep in your soul that you are held by a God who will never let you fall, who will never abandon you to your circumstances, who will always make a way when there seems to be no way, it affects every decision you make, every fear you face, every hope you hold, every prayer you pray, every step you take into an uncertain future that suddenly doesn't seem nearly as scary as it used to, because you know who holds tomorrow and you know he holds you too. And that knowledge, that assurance, that unshakable confidence in his goodness and love becomes the foundation for a life lived in freedom rather than fear, in faith rather than anxiety, in expectation rather than dread, in joy rather than desperation. Because you've seen what he can do, you've experienced what he will do, you've lived through proof of what he does do for his children who learn to trust him, who dare to depend on him, who choose to believe in his goodness even when circumstances suggest otherwise, even when timing doesn't make sense, even when provision comes in ways they wouldn't have chosen, because his ways are always perfect even when they're not predictable. His timing is always right, even when it doesn't feel timely. His provision is always sufficient even when it doesn't seem substantial. His love is always present even when it doesn't feel perceptible. And learning to live from that truth, learning to operate from that reality, learning to function from that foundation had changed not just my financial situation, but my entire approach to life, my whole understanding of what it means to be a child of God, my complete comprehension of what it looks like to live in relationship with a father who takes care of his children, not just spiritually, but practically, not just eternally, but daily, not just in big ways, but in small ways, not just dramatically, but consistently, not just occasionally, but constantly. Because that's who he is. That's what love does. That's how family works in the kingdom of God, where every child matters, every need is seen, every tear is counted, every prayer is heard, every struggle is known, every victory is celebrated, and every story becomes part of a larger narrative of God's goodness that encourages faith, builds hope, strengthens trust, and demonstrates to a watching world that our God is not just the God of theological concepts, but the God of grocery money. Not just the God of eternal matters, but the God of electric bills, not just the God of spiritual things, but the God of material needs, not just the God of church services, but the God of everyday life in all its beautiful, messy, complicated, overwhelming, amazing reality. I didn't just survive financial lack. I learned who God was in it, learned who I was in him, learned that his provision goes so much deeper than money, so much wider than circumstances, so much higher than anything I could ask or think or imagine, and that education, that revelation, that transformation was worth every sleepless night, every anxious moment, every tear I cried, every prayer I whispered in desperation, because it connected me to the heart of a God who loves his children so much that he will allow them to walk through valleys in order to show them mountains they never knew existed, will permit temporary discomfort in order to produce eternal confidence, will use what the enemy meant for harm to bring about good that exceeds anything we could have experienced, if we had never needed rescue in the first place, will orchestrate circumstances that seem impossible in order to demonstrate possibilities we never knew were available, will allow us to reach the end of our own resources in order to introduce us to His unlimited resources, will let us exhaust our own solutions in order to reveal His supernatural solutions, will permit us to experience our own inadequacy in order to showcase His perfect adequacy, and in doing so will teach us lessons about His character, His love, His faithfulness, His provision that we could never learn in a classroom, never read in a book, never understand through explanation, but can only discover through experience, through walking with Him through the fire, and discovering that we're not alone, that we're not forgotten, that we're not abandoned, but that we're held, we're loved, we're provided for, we're being prepared for something greater than we could imagine, something better than we could ask for, something more beautiful than we could design for ourselves. Because that's what God does. That's who He is. That's how He works in the lives of His children who learn to trust Him through the valleys so they can reign with Him on the mountains, who learn to depend on Him in scarcity so they can steward His abundance with wisdom, who learn to receive His provision in difficult times so they can be His provision to others in their difficult times, because that's how the kingdom works. That's how love spreads. That's how testimonies are born. That's how God's goodness is demonstrated to a world that desperately needs to know that He still sees, still cares, still provides, still rescues, still transforms impossible situations into incredible testimonies that declare His faithfulness for generations to come. And my story had become one of those testimonies. My life had become one of those demonstrations. My experience had become one of those proofs that God is still God, still good, still faithful, still providing, still loving His children too much to leave them in any situation that doesn't ultimately serve their highest good and His greatest glory. And that truth, that reality, that unshakable foundation had become the bedrock of a life lived in grateful recognition that I had been rescued not just from financial crisis, but from spiritual poverty, not just from material lack, but from emotional despair, not just from circumstantial difficulty, but from identity confusion, because I had learned who I really was in Him, what I was really worth to Him, how much I was really loved by Him, and that knowledge had set me free to live with confidence, with peace, with joy, with hope, with expectation, with gratitude, with generosity, with all the beautiful qualities that emerge in the life of someone who knows they are held, they are loved, they are provided for, they are watched over, they are cared for by a God whose love never fails, whose provision never runs out, whose faithfulness never wavers, whose commitment to His children never diminishes, whose plans for them are always good, always perfect, always exactly what they need exactly when they need it most, even when they can't see it, even when they can't understand it, even when they can't feel it. Because His love doesn't depend on their perception. His provision doesn't require their comprehension. His faithfulness doesn't need their approval. It just is. Constant as the sunrise, reliable as the seasons, dependable as gravity, and more powerful than any circumstance, any challenge, any crisis, any difficulty, any impossibility they could ever face. Because nothing is impossible with God. Nothing is too hard for Him. Nothing is beyond His ability to change, to transform, to redeem, to restore, to resurrect, to make beautiful, to make meaningful, to make into a testimony of His goodness that will encourage faith, build hope, strengthen trust, and point others to the one who is the source of all provision, all blessing, all breakthrough, all miracle, all grace, all love, all life. Because that's who He is, that's what He does, that's how He works, and that's the end of this chapter of my story and the beginning of all the chapters yet to come. Chapters that will be written with the same hands that carried me through this valley, chapters that will be filled with the same love that rescued me from this crisis, chapters that will demonstrate the same faithfulness that provided for me in this impossible situation. Because my God doesn't change, His love doesn't diminish, His provision doesn't run out, His faithfulness doesn't waver, and His commitment to His children doesn't end. It just continues, story after story, generation after generation, testimony after testimony, miracle after miracle, until every person who needs to know His love knows it. Every person who needs to experience His provision experiences it. Every person who needs to witness His faithfulness witnesses it. And every person who needs to receive His grace receives it. Because that's His heart, that's His desire, that's His plan, and I get to be part of it. We all get to be part of it because we're His children and He loves us and He takes care of what belongs to Him. Always, perfectly, completely, lovingly, faithfully. And that's enough, more than enough, abundantly enough for whatever comes next in this beautiful, God-written, perfectly provided for life He's given us to live. And to live it well, and to live it fully, and to live it gratefully, and to live it generously, and to live it hopefully, and to live it faithfully, because we serve a faithful God who will never let us down, never let us fall, never let us go. Because we are His and He is ours, and nothing can separate us from His love. Nothing can stop His provision. Nothing can cancel His plans for us. And those plans are good, always good, perfectly good, and they're unfolding right now in ways we can see and ways we can't see, and that's the most beautiful truth in the universe, the most comforting reality in existence, the most powerful force in creation, and it's ours. It belongs to us. It's working for us. It's blessing us. It's keeping us. It's carrying us. It's providing for us. It's loving us, and it always will. Because that's who God is, and that's who we are in Him, and that's how this story ends. Not with questions, but with answers. Not with doubt, but with faith. Not with fear, but with confidence. Not with despair, but with hope. Not with lack, but with abundance. Not with defeat, but with victory. Because we serve a God who always wins, who always provides, who always loves, who always rescues, who always restores, who always redeems, and who always, always, always takes care of His children. And that's the most beautiful ending to any story, the most perfect conclusion to any testimony, the most powerful demonstration of any love, and it's ours, and it's real, and it's forever. Because our God is forever, and His love is forever, and His provision is forever, and His faithfulness is forever, and we are forever His, and He is forever ours, and that's the end and the beginning of everything that matters, everything that lasts, everything that's true, everything that's beautiful, everything that's good, everything that's perfect, everything that's eternal. Because God is all of those things and we belong to Him and He belongs to us, and nothing will ever change that. Nothing will ever diminish that. Nothing will ever separate us from that, because that's love, that's family, that's kingdom, that's home, that's where we belong, that's who we are. That's how this story really ends, with love winning, with provision flowing, with faith standing, with hope rising, with joy coming, with peace remaining, with God reigning, and with His children living happily ever after, not because their circumstances are always perfect, but because their Father is always faithful, always loving, always providing, always present, always working, always blessing, always keeping, always holding, always carrying them through whatever comes, whatever goes, whatever changes, whatever stays the same, because He never changes, He never fails, He never gives up. He never lets go. He never stops loving. He never stops providing. He never stops being God, and that's the most beautiful truth in the universe, and it's ours forever and ever and ever. Amen.